A newlywed couple, just days away from celebrating their first wedding anniversary, is found dead inside their car on a quiet Illinois highway. Their hazard lights were still flashing when police arrived. There were no signs of a crash, no sign of struggle, just two young lives cut short in the middle of the road. How did this happen? That's the question haunting both families, investigators, and an entire community tonight. Welcome to Criminal Mind Tales. This is the story of Rachel and Brandon Dumovich, a couple who seem to have everything ahead of them. And yet, in a matter of moments, that future vanished. The discovery happened late on the night of October 6th, 2025, along Route 14 in Harvard, Illinois, a small town near the Wisconsin border. A patrol officer noticed a car pulled to the shoulder with its hazard lights blinking through the darkness. It looked at first like a simple roadside stop, maybe a flat tire or a driver making a late-night call. But as the officer drew closer, something about the stillness inside the car didn't feel right. When he shone his flashlight through a window, he saw two people motionless inside, a man and a woman. The officer called out. No response. Within seconds, the scene shifted from routine patrol to emergency response. Inside the vehicle, officers found Rachel Noel Dumovich, 29, and her husband Brandon Peter Dumovich, 30. Both had sustained gunshot wounds. A handgun was found within the car. By the time paramedics arrived, neither showed signs of life. The road was quickly sealed off with yellow tape. Blue and red lights pulsed against the trees as additional units arrived. Forensic teams began their work, photographing, collecting shell casings, and marking every trace of evidence inside the car. Within an hour, the McHenry County Coroner's Office was notified. A temporary shelter-in-place order went out to nearby residents, while officers worked to confirm there was no threat to the public. That order was lifted later that night after investigators concluded the incident appeared contained to the vehicle. But the phrasing, "no active threat to the community," raised its own questions. If no one else was involved, then what exactly happened inside that car? By dawn, word had spread to the tight-knit communities of Harvard, Illinois, and Sharon, Wisconsin, where the couple lived. Two newlyweds gone. No witnesses, no suspects, no arrests, and no clear motive. Just 24 hours earlier, Rachel had posted a photo of a sunset on social media, captioned, "Forever chasing sunsets, wishing we were back in Greece." It was a nod to the couple's honeymoon months earlier, a trip filled with joy, sunlight, and laughter. No one scrolling through her feed could have imagined that post would be her last. To those who knew them, Rachel and Brandon were inseparable. Their love story began when they were only 12 years old, middle school classmates whose friendship slowly turned into something more. According to their wedding website, Rachel had once stolen a bottle of cologne from Brandon's locker just to get his attention. Life took them in different directions for a while, but in 2022 they reconnected, fell back in love, and married 2 years later on October 14th, 2024, during a lakeside ceremony in Slinger, Wisconsin. It was supposed to be a lifelong beginning. Rachel was known for her brilliance and warmth. A 2014 graduate of Crystal Lake South High School, she was a two-sport varsity athlete and later earned her Bachelor of Business Administration, cum laude, from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Friends describe her as outgoing, empathetic, and deeply loyal, the kind of person who made everyone feel seen. She volunteered with Big Brothers Big Sisters of Metro Milwaukee and loved mentoring younger girls. Brandon had just turned 30. The couple had celebrated his birthday only a day before the tragedy. A U.S. Navy veteran, he was remembered for his discipline, humor, and devotion to family. He loved the outdoors, snowmobiling, and remote-controlled aircraft. His friends called him the life of the party, the kind of man who never left anyone out. The two had bought a home in Sharon, just across the Wisconsin border, and were building a life filled with plans, travel, family, and careers. They were happy, grounded, and deeply in love, which made what happened that night all the more unthinkable. As investigators combed through the scene, they recovered the firearm and began tracing its serial number. Ballistics testing was ordered. The coroner began autopsies the following morning. Detectives examined phone records, checked surveillance footage from nearby gas stations and businesses, and canvassed for witnesses. But Nothing pointed to anyone else being there. No witnesses reported gunshots. No one saw another car flee the area. And by the department's own statement, there were no suspects, no arrests, and no persons of interest. That absence of answers made the tragedy even harder to process. The Harvard Police Department, assisted by the McHenry County Major Investigation Assistance Team, MIAT, continued their work behind the scenes. Toxicology reports would take weeks, and until those results came back, authorities would not label the case a murder-suicide, double homicide, or accident. For the Dumovich and Noel families, those weeks were unbearable. They waited not only for clarity, but for closure. Friends and neighbors organized candlelight vigils. Online, people shared wedding photos, videos from the reception, and stories about the couple's kindness. Rachel's co-workers at her marketing firm remembered how she brought coffee for everyone on early mornings. Brandon's Navy friends wrote about his loyalty and courage. The grief was immense, but so was the confusion. Why would a couple who seemed so deeply in love end up like this? What happened in that small window of time between leaving home and stopping on the side of Route 14? The evidence, investigators believed, would eventually tell that story. The angle of each wound, the residue patterns, the fingerprints on the firearm, the timestamps on their phones. Every piece would matter. For now, though, the community was left with silence, and two families planning separate funerals for the same tragedy. Rachel's obituary celebrated a vibrant and driven young woman who dedicated her life to helping others. Brandon's described a man who lit up every room and loved with his whole heart. Neither obituary mentioned the other, an omission that spoke volumes about how fragile the situation had become for grieving relatives, united in heartbreak, divided by questions. By the end of that week, the car had been towed for a second forensic sweep. The location where it was found, once lined with police tape and flashing lights, now looked ordinary again. But for anyone who knew the story, that stretch of Route 14 would never look ordinary. A newlywed couple, a car with its hazards flashing, 2 gunshot wounds, a recovered firearm, and no answers. Police said the investigation was ongoing. But as of that day, no arrests, no suspects, no charges, no persons of interest, which left everyone asking the same haunting question. If no one else was there, what truly happened inside that car? Just before midnight on October 6th, Route 14 in Harvard, Illinois, lay quiet under a silver-gray sky. The road was nearly empty, lined by fields and faint lights from distant farmhouses. A Harvard police officer on patrol noticed a car pulled to the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking steadily in the dark. It wasn't unusual to find a stranded motorist on that stretch, but something about the stillness of the vehicle felt wrong. The officer slowed down, parking behind it, and stepped into the cool night air. Through the window, the orange flash of the hazard lights revealed 2 people motionless in the front seats. The driver, a young woman, appeared slumped forward. The passenger beside her sat still, head tilted slightly toward the glass. The officer called it in immediately. Within minutes, backup and paramedics arrived, and Route 14 was transformed into a maze of flashing lights and reflective tape. Both occupants were declared dead at the scene. They were soon identified as Rachel and Brandon Dumovich, a married couple just days away from their first wedding anniversary. Each had suffered gunshot wounds. A firearm was found inside the car. Officers secured the perimeter, photographing every angle, marking the asphalt with evidence tags, and collecting shell casings. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken glass, and nothing to suggest an outside struggle. Rachel's phone and purse were still beside her. Brandon's wallet remained untouched in his pocket. Their hazard lights were still flashing. The discovery of the gun inside the vehicle added a grim puzzle. There was no immediate indication of another person at the scene, and the car doors had been locked from the inside. Investigators processed the area through the night, documenting everything. The position of the bodies, the residue on their clothing, the trajectories that might explain what happened in those final seconds. When dawn broke, police issued a short statement confirming 2 people had been found dead from gunshot wounds in a parked vehicle. Out of caution, a shelter-in-place order was briefly enacted, but it was lifted soon after. The department stated there was no ongoing threat to the public. Whatever had happened, it appeared to have taken place entirely within the car. By morning, the town of Harvard was in shock. News spread quickly through social media and local outlets. Residents who had driven down Route 14 the night before now realized what those flashing lights had meant. Friends began calling one another, trying to understand how such a tragedy could happen to a couple everyone described as inseparable, full of warmth and laughter. Detectives began reconstructing the Dumovich's final hours. They reviewed surveillance footage from nearby intersections and businesses, hoping to track the car's route. They obtained phone records, searching for calls or messages that could explain their movements that night. The firearm was sent for ballistic testing. Toxicology and autopsy examinations were ordered to the McHenry County Coroner's Office. Officials released few details. They confirmed that the case remained open and active, with no suspects, no arrests, and no persons of interest. The silence from investigators left room only for quiet speculation. But those closest to the couple wanted facts, not theories. Rachel and Brandon's story had always seemed like one built on longevity and devotion. They first met as middle school classmates. Rachel once recalled, with a teasing smile, that she caught Brandon's attention by stealing cologne from his locker. Years later, after 15 years of friendship, they reconnected and began dating. Brandon proposed at Big Cedar Lake in Slinger, Wisconsin, the place where Rachel spent her childhood summers. Their wedding took place there in October 2024, surrounded by family and friends, the lake reflecting autumn light behind them. Their honeymoon in Greece followed soon after, and Rachel's social media brimmed with sunlight, sea, and affection. Her last post read, "Forever chasing sunsets, wishing we were back in Greece." Hours later, she would be gone. In Harvard, the community's grief ran deep. Vigils were held. Candles flickered against the chill of early October. Friends described them as gentle souls, deeply devoted to each other. Both of their obituaries, published in the following days, painted portraits of love and purpose. Brandon's tribute spoke of a man who brought laughter wherever he went, who served proudly in the U.S. Navy, who loved anything with an engine, snowmobiles, boats, and RC planes. His friends said he lived to bring joy to others, that his humor could fill a room. Rachel's obituary described a woman who excelled in everything she did, a two-sport varsity athlete, a University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee graduate with honors, and a volunteer with Big Brothers Big Sisters. She was remembered for her empathy, her determination, and her ability to lift others through kindness and conviction. One quiet detail drew attention. Neither obituary mentioned the other. There was no reference to a beloved wife or devoted husband. It could have been an oversight, or it could have meant something deeper. Only the families knew, but it added another layer of silence to a case already heavy with unanswered questions. The investigation continued, guided by forensics and patience. Experts explained that testing the weapon against the recovered projectiles could confirm whether it was the gun used in the shootings. Gunshot residue tests on both victims' hands and clothing would determine who had fired it. Autopsy results would clarify angles and distances of the wounds. Every clue, no matter how small, could tell investigators what happened in those final seconds inside the car. For the families, time slowed. The blinking lights on Route 14 had long since faded, but the image lingered. 2 young lives, the promise of shared future, suddenly gone. Friends scrolled through old photos, unable to reconcile the faces smiling in sunlight with the news headlines that now bore their names. Police remained quiet. No public conclusion was drawn. No official statement of cause or manner of death. Just the same line repeated in each release. The case remains an open and active investigation. The car, now impounded and sealed, held the answers. Inside its confined space lay the evidence of what happened and perhaps why. But until the results came back, until the coroner signed off, until reports aligned, Harvard waited in the uneasy space between grief and understanding. For now, the only sound left of that night was the slow pulse of hazard lights, flickering in memory long after they had gone dark. In the days following the discovery on Route 14, grief and disbelief rippled through Harvard, Illinois. The Dumovich case dominated local news cycles. A young couple found dead, a gun inside their vehicle, and no clear explanation. It was a kind of tragedy that unsettled even the most stoic residents. Police press conferences offered little comfort. Each statement ended the same way: no suspects, no arrests, no danger to the public. But that assurance did little to quiet a community haunted by how little anyone truly knew. Detectives worked methodically, retracing the couple's steps in the hours before their deaths. They pieced together a timeline from phone data, surveillance footage, and witness accounts. Around 9:30 p.m. on October 6th, Rachel and Brandon were seen leaving their home. The route they took was familiar, one they had driven countless times before. There were no signs of pursuit, no erratic driving captured on cameras. Their car simply moved through the night until it pulled over on the shoulder of Route 14 and never moved again. Behind the scenes, forensic analysts were dissecting the evidence. The firearm recovered from a vehicle was sent to the Illinois State Police Crime Lab for ballistic comparison. Technicians matched shell casings to the gun's firing pin marks, building a mechanical fingerprint needed to confirm it as the weapon that ended both lives. Gunshot residue tests were conducted to determine who had discharged the weapon, if at all. Each microscopic particle held the potential to rewrite the narrative. Autopsies revealed that both Rachel and Brandon died from gunshot wounds. Investigators did not immediately specify the manner of death, whether it was murder-suicide or double homicide. That distinction mattered deeply, not just to law enforcement, but to two grieving families now walking through identical heartbreaks from opposite sides of the same mystery. Rachel's family, still reeling from her sudden loss, described her as radiant and compassionate, someone whose ambition was matched only by her warmth. She had worked in healthcare administration and was known to check in on patients even when it wasn't required. Her friends remembered how she would write handwritten notes of encouragement and how she loved fall, the season she chose for her wedding. Brandon's family remembered a man devoted to service, laughter, and the people he loved. He had spent years in the U.S. Navy and carried a deep respect for structure, for doing things the right way. To them, he was steady, protective, the kind of person who made others feel safe. But behind the heartfelt tributes lay an unspoken question. What could have possibly gone wrong between them? The couple's social media painted a different story. Smiling honeymoon photos from Santorini, playful banter in comments, and posts celebrating their first year together. They looked happy. To outsiders, there was no visible trace of the storm that may have been brewing beneath. Online, theories multiplied. Some believed it was a targeted attack, a road encounter gone wrong. Others speculated that one of them had reached a breaking point. The police, however, refused to entertain speculation. Every public statement was restrained, factual, and brief. Detectives emphasized that the investigation was still active and that more information would be released once results were conclusive. Meanwhile, residents of Harvard continued to mourn. The town organized memorials. Flowers and candles lined the guardrail along Route 14 where the car had been found. Strangers stopped to pray, to leave notes, to whisper hopes that the truth would soon emerge. In the quiet aftermath, both families made funeral arrangements. Services were held separately, attended by overlapping circles of friends who now found themselves navigating grief on divided paths. Each ceremony was filled with photographs of the couple's happiest moments, their wedding, their vacations, their laughter. Yet even in remembrance, there was a sense of something unfinished, something waiting to be explained. As days turned into weeks, attention shifted to the McHenry County Coroner's Office. The autopsy results, toxicology reports, and ballistic confirmations were expected to offer the first concrete clues. Detectives reviewed all evidence again, ensuring that nothing had been missed. They mapped out positions, distances, and residue patterns inside the vehicle, searching for the sequence of events that could transform a love story into tragedy. Then came the update that would quietly change everything. Investigators confirmed that no third party was involved in the deaths of Rachel and Brandon Dumovich. The weapon belonged to one of them, and the evidence pointed to an internal act of violence, not an external attack. But police stopped short of publicly labeling it a murder-suicide. Officially, they maintained that the case was still under review, pending final forensic confirmation. Behind closed doors, though, families began to absorb the implications. It wasn't an intruder nor a random crime. Whatever happened on that dark roadside had unfolded between the two people inside the car and no one else. For the Dumovich and Schwant families, that revelation deepened the ache. Grief now intertwined with confusion, guilt, and the human need for understanding that would likely never come. Those who had known the couple best were left replaying every conversation, every small sign that might have hinted at unrest. But no one had seen it coming. One of Rachel's close friends later told reporters, "They looked so happy. If there was something wrong, she hid it well. They both did." The official silence continued. No names were released in connection to who had fired the gun. No motive was shared. No timeline of confrontation was confirmed. The final word from police was simple and spare. The investigation is complete, and the findings will be submitted to the state's attorney's office for review. And with that, the mystery retreated into shadows of sealed reports and quiet heartbreak, a tragedy that began as a love story and ended with two lives forever frozen on the side of an empty highway, hazard lights blinking into the dark. In the weeks that followed, the Dumovich case drifted from headlines to whispers. The flashing hazard lights that had once burned into the collective memory of a small Illinois town had long been extinguished, yet their glow lingered in people's minds. The road on which Rachel and Brandon were found became a place of quiet visits. Bouquets left by strangers, candles melted into the dirt, handwritten notes weighed down by stones, so the wind wouldn't carry them away. The investigation, though formally closed, had left a hollow silence in its wake. Both families tried to make sense of something that refused to make sense. The coroner's findings were conclusive. Both Rachel and Brandon had died from gunshot wounds. Forensic analysis confirmed that a single weapon had been used and that no evidence pointed to the involvement of anyone else. What wasn't detailed, however, was what led to that final moment. What was said, what broke, or what pushed two people who once promised forever into tragedy. In Crystal Lake, where Rachel had grown up, her friends gathered to remember her. They spoke not of the circumstances of her death, but the life she had lived, the laughter she brought, the small acts of kindness she seemed to scatter everywhere she went. At a candlelight vigil, one of her mentors from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee described her as the kind of person who walked into a room and made it warmer. In contrast, Brandon's hometown remembered him through his sense of discipline and duty. Former Navy colleagues described him as dependable, focused, and respectful, a man whose calm under pressure had saved others more than once. His family spoke of his humor, his quiet strength, and his love of the outdoors. To those who had served with him, the thought of him losing control seemed almost impossible. But that was the pain that lingered, the impossibility of it all. The investigation's conclusion, though supported by physical evidence, provided no emotional closure. Law enforcement agencies, including the Harvard Police Department and McHenry County Sheriff's Office, reiterated that no threat existed to the public. Still, for those who loved Rachel and Brandon, that assurance rang hollow. The absence of suspect did not erase the presence of grief. Online, the story took on a life of its own. Threads, videos, and discussions speculated endlessly about what might have happened inside that car. Some focused on the timeline, others on the psychology of sudden tragedy. People dissected old social media posts, wedding photos, and even the way they smiled at each other, try to read signs that were never there. In an age of instant conclusions, the Dumovich case became an uncomfortable reminder that some truths remain sealed inside the moments no one sees. The families, now bound by loss rather than marriage, try to preserve dignity amid the noise. Publicly, they asked for privacy. Privately, they leaned on faith and memory, choosing to focus on the years of joy rather than the seconds of despair. A joint statement from both sides read simply, "They were loved deeply and will be remembered for the light they brought into our lives." Investigators, meanwhile, moved on to new cases, their reports filed and archived. But for a few officers who had been first on the scene that October night, the image of the car, its lights flickering in the darkness, was difficult to forget. One detective later remarked off-record that it was one of the quietest scenes he had ever encountered. No signs of struggle, no chaos, no intrusion. Just stillness and the low hum of engines passing by. What lingered most was the question of why. Friends and family searched for clues in their last interactions. Text messages, voicemails, and photos from the weekend before offered nothing out of place. There were plans for the future, hints of upcoming travel, even casual jokes. Nothing that foretold what would come. And yet, as investigators often say, every tragedy leaves traces of pain that only reveal themselves in hindsight. Perhaps it was something small, a conversation unspoken, a burden quietly carried. Or perhaps it was a moment of impulsive despair no one could predict it. The police never confirmed the sequence, but the evidence suggested that whatever happened occurred quickly. Rachel's co-workers remembered that she had spoken often about her hopes for the future, the home they wanted to buy, the children they hoped to have. Those close to her said she had never seemed afraid. She was, in their eyes, happy and grounded. The contrast between that and the outcome of October 6th was what made the loss so incomprehensible. In their final report, investigators noted that there was no evidence of a third party and no indication of struggle. Gunshot residue testing, trajectory analysis, and autopsy findings collectively supported an internal act, an event contained entirely within the vehicle. Beyond that, the file was redacted. The case, at least officially, had reached its end. But for those left behind, endings are rarely clean. Closure, if it came at all, came in fragments. The sound of Rachel's laugh caught in an old video, Brandon's military photograph framed in a living room, the quiet ache of anniversaries that would never be celebrated again. The world moved on, as it always does, but the Dumovich families live with an unspoken truth, that sometimes love stories end not because the love fades, but because the weight of something unseen becomes too heavy to carry. On Route 14, the roadside memorial still stands. Flowers wilt and are replaced. Candles burn down and are relit. People stop, even months later, not because they knew Rachel or Brandon, but because the story refuses to leave them. It reminds everyone who passes that behind every tragedy are two people who once believed in forever, and that sometimes forever ends without warning. Months passed, but the Dumovich case never really left the hearts of those who had followed it. For a brief moment, the story had filled every headline, every conversation in Harvard, Illinois. Two lives intertwined, cut short, and found beneath the steady blink of hazard lights. Now it existed in fragments, archive reports, news articles, and photographs that once told a story of love and beginnings. What remained was the haunting question that refused to fade, not how they died, but why. The official record was closed. The police file listed the findings succinctly: 2 gunshot wounds, a single weapon recovered, no signs of struggle, no evidence of third-party involvement. The coroner's report echoed the same. It was, by every measure, an isolated act. But isolation does not make comprehension easier. For the families, it only deepened the silence, a silence where answers should have been. In the absence of new developments, people turned to memory. Those who had known Rachel and Brandon separately began sharing stories that painted 2 vivid portraits and revealed how they had come to cross paths in the first place. Rachel, with her degree in healthcare administration and her volunteer work with Big Brothers Big Sisters, had a life steeped in empathy. Her colleagues described her as someone who carried the emotional burdens of others with quiet grace. She smiled often, worked hard, and believed deeply in people's goodness. Brandon, by contrast, was a man defined by precision. Years in the U.S. Navy had instilled in him an order and steadiness that few possessed. Friends recalled how he would be the first to lend a hand, the last to leave a task undone. After returning to civilian life, he had tried to balance that discipline with a new chapter, one filled with adventure, travel, and love. Their story began, as so many do, in the most ordinary way, a mutual friends gathering. They had connected instantly, drawn together by humor and warmth. Over time, their relationship grew quietly but deeply, their bond strengthening through shared values rather than grand gestures. When they married at Big Cedar Lake in Slinger, Wisconsin, it had felt like a beginning written in sunlight. A new chapter neither of them could have known would be so brief. But even love stories, no matter how pure, can exist alongside invisible struggles. Friends and family admitted later that they hadn't noticed anything wrong. There were no outward signs of distress, no warnings, no messages that hinted at despair or danger. That, perhaps, was what haunted them most. In December, a small gathering was held in their memory. a joint tribute where friends from both families met for the first time since the tragedy. The atmosphere was somber but gentle, focused on remembrance rather than speculation. Candles flickered on tables and photos lined the room. Their wedding, their travels, their smiles frozen in time. Someone played one of Rachel's favorite songs, a soft, hopeful tune that filled the room with quiet ache. As the months wore on, the case became less about investigation and more about legacy. Local organizations in Crystal Lake began discussing ways to honor Rachel's commitment to helping others. There were talks of scholarships or community volunteer programs created in her name. Brandon's family focused on veterans' mental health awareness, determined to turn loss into something that could help others find hope. What united both sides was an understanding that closure would never come from police files or reports. It would come, instead, from remembrance, from refusing to let the story dissolve into rumor or speculation. Because beneath the headlines were two real people who would build a life together, however short, on love, trust, and shared dreams. Investigators occasionally revisited the case for procedural review. The file was complete, but every so often, a detective would recheck an angle, ensuring nothing had been overlooked. It's one of those cases that stays with you. One officer reportedly said, "You want there to be more to find, but sometimes there just isn't." Even as time dulled the immediacy of the tragedy, Route 14 remained unchanged, the same long stretch of asphalt cutting through the Illinois countryside, where headlights pierced the darkness and the wind carried the faint hum of distant traffic. To passers-by, it looked like any other road, but for those who knew what happened there, it was sacred ground. By early spring, the memorial still stood, though the seasons had worn it down. Rain had faded the ink on the letters left behind. The flowers had long since withered, but someone, perhaps a stranger, had tied a new bouquet of white lilies to the guardrail. The gesture was small, quiet, and anonymous, but it spoke volumes. In a way, the Dumovich story became more than a case file. It became a symbol of how fragile life can be, how little we sometimes understand even those we love most. People shared their story not out of morbid curiosity, but out of empathy, a reminder that behind statistics and reports, there are human hearts that once beat with hope. The families, in time, found their own ways to honor that hope. They spoke not how Rachel and Brandon died, but how they lived, how they laughed, how they gave, and how, for a time, they made each other's worlds brighter. Their love, though it ended in tragedy, became something larger in memory, a call to cherish the people we hold close, to speak love aloud, and to never take time for granted. By the 1-year mark, the investigation had long been closed, but for the community, it never truly faded. It became a quiet chapter in local history, not defined by mystery, but by mourning and reflection. The town learned something unspoken that year, that sometimes there is no villain, no clear explanation, no satisfying conclusion. Sometimes a story ends in a silence that even truth cannot fill. And yet, in that silence, the echo of who Rachel and Brandon were, kind, driven, deeply loved, continues to live on. Every candle lit at the memorial, every story retold, every whispered prayer keeps their memory alive. On that lonely stretch of Route 14, time moves forward, but the light of their memory refuses to dim. 1 year later, the road where it all ended looked almost unchanged. Route 14 still wound to the edge of Harvard, Illinois, a stretch of highway lined with open fields and quiet farmhouses. The traffic moved steadily, unaware of the weight that lingered on that shoulder. The same spot where, on an October night, 2 lives had quietly slipped away. Most drivers didn't notice the small wooden cross fixed near the guardrail, the faded flowers, or the soft ring of a wind chime that someone had tied to the post. But for those who remembered Rachel and Brandon Dumovich, it was impossible to pass by without feeling the ache of everything that had been lost. By the first anniversary, the case had been long closed. The official findings remained simple, clinical, and absolute. 2 gunshot wounds, 1 firearm recovered, no sign of outside involvement. Police concluded their reports with the same restrained phrasing that had defined the investigation. There was no danger to the public. But beyond the paperwork, grief was still raw. Families and friends were left to wrestle with the same question that had echoed from the very beginning. How could two people who seemed so full of love, so full of promise, end this way? That question had no answer, and perhaps it never would. Rachel's family gathered in Crystal Lake that day. They lit candles in her honor and released small paper lanterns into the cool autumn air. Her mother, who rarely spoke publicly about the case, said quietly that she chose to focus not on the tragedy, but on the 29 years her daughter had lived fully, her laughter, her faith, her boundless compassion. The lanterns drifted upward, vanishing one by one into the twilight, carrying her memory toward the same sky she had loved to photograph. In another town, Brandon's family held their own service. Quieter, more private. His father placed his Navy cap on a table beside his portrait. There were photos of him hiking, smiling, his arm around Rachel during their wedding, the two of them looking every bit the image of young love. His family chose to honor his service, his loyalty, and the life he built after returning home. They didn't dwell on the ending. They focused on his years of discipline, kindness, and steady humor that had touched those around him. The tragedy had left both families scarred, yet somehow united. In the months after the investigation closed, they had reached out to one another. Two households once joined by marriage, now connected by something far heavier. What had begun as confusion evolved into compassion. They exchanged messages, checked in on holidays, and found solace in shared grief. No accusations, no bitterness, just quiet understanding that love, even broken by loss, could still bind people together. For the Harvard Police Department, the Dumovich file sat among countless others in a temperature-controlled archive room. Detectives who had worked the scene said it remained one of the most haunting cases of their careers. There was nothing we could fix, one of them reflected in an interview months later. No suspect to pursue, no threat to stop. It was just tragedy, pure and unsolvable. The story itself, however, lived on. News outlets occasionally revisited it on anniversaries, while online communities continued to discuss it, less out of intrigue now and more out of empathy. It had become a cautionary tale about unseen pain, a reflection of how even the happiest images can conceal private storms. Mental health advocates cited it as a reminder of why it's important to reach out, to ask, to listen, because sometimes even those who seem strongest are quietly fighting battles no one can see. At the memorial site, visitors left fresh flowers and new notes. One letter, written in a looping hand and pinned beneath a small rock, read, "You didn't know me, but your story changed me. It made me call my sister. It made me say I love you more often." That became the quiet legacy of Rachel and Brandon Dumovich. Not the tragedy itself, but what people learned from it. Their story became a mirror for others, reminding them that love needs presence, that small silences matter, and that moments taken for granted can be the most precious of all. As autumn deepened, the wind to the fields along Route 14 grew colder. The days shortened, and the evening light stretched long over the empty highway. Yet the memorial remained, steadfast, weathered, and peaceful. Every now and then, someone would pull over, leave a flower, and linger in silence, as if to pay respect not just to two lives lost, but to the fragility of life itself. What happened in that car on October 6th remains locked forever between the two who lived it. The world will never fully understand, but perhaps that's the point. Some stories aren't meant to be solved, only remembered. So the town remembers. Rachel's laughter echoing in old videos. Brandon's calm voice captured in home clips. The way they looked at each other in wedding photographs. The kind of love that still radiates even through the pain of knowing how it ended. Their story remains suspended in time, where joy and sorrow coexist and where light, however dimmed, still finds a way to shine through the dark. And when night falls over Route 14, headlights flicker across the asphalt, momentarily illuminating the small white cross, and the faint shimmer of the wind chimes swaying beside it. The sound is soft, almost imperceptible, like a whisper carried on the wind, a reminder that even in silence, they are still remembered. Always,